All right. We're very fortunate to have with us here Martin Griffiths, the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, who briefed the member states just earlier this morning. Mr. Griffiths.
Thank you so much. Let me turn this off, I think. Thanks, Farhan. Thank you for this opportunity. I have a sort of number of points I wanted to make, and then, should I go here?
Yeah, maybe go into that one.
Yeah.
That's the one that's got the.
Hello? Yeah.
That's the one that's got the juice.
That's the one that's good. Now, centered. Okay. So I'll just do some of my remarks and then we can get beyond that. Obviously delighted to be here. It's been quite a week since the signing last Friday of those two agreements in Istanbul by the Secretary General. And I want to speak to the issue of the implementation of the Black Sea Initiative, which was the part of the package that the Secretary General had asked me to lead on, to mediate for the UN. But as I start, I would like to make the point that I have made elsewhere, which is that this particular project, this negotiation project, started when the Secretary General went to Ankara, Moscow, and Kyiv towards the end of April, 3 months ago. And it was entirely his initiative that put so much weight, his own weight, as it were, into pushing for this deal that we saw signed, the two deals that we saw signed on Friday. My office had been pressing him to negotiate what later became the joint operation we had with ICRC on Mariupol and Azovstal. And he did that. And as you'll remember, we then, with the help and support of the Ukrainian authorities and the Russian Federation, were involved in that operation. And that also introduced us to many people that were later involved in the negotiations that we'd just been through this last 3 months. But he insisted on this much larger, much more ambitious, much more important in many ways process. I don't need to say again, and Vera Songwe this morning, I think, spoke very competently to it about the reason for it, the potential impact on material access to grain and fertilizers around the world, the impact on prices, and so on and so forth. She's done that much better than me. But I want to talk a little bit about what's happened since the signing and what perhaps went into the signing before, and I'll start with that. We began our work as a team of officials from all parts of the United Nations system, the International Maritime Organization in particular, with their very specific expertise, one of whom is now our interim lead, Admiral Fred Kenny, retired Admiral Fred Kenny, who is in the lead in Istanbul as we speak. The World Food Programme, of course, colleagues from there, DPPA, the Legal Advisors Office, OCHA, and we also benefited from the presence in our team from a representative from the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, which had a lengthy experience in Ukraine, involved in the Minsk Agreement. So it was a very embracing operation in terms of people from all parts of the system. And it reinforces my first point, which is that this truly is, as we see it, because of the Secretary General's role and because of the way we went through it together, a multilateral operation, a reminder that multilateralism isn't dead, as some of us had worried about and predicted. So that's, I think, our first point. And it does seem that we will not get a statement out of the Security Council. Maybe those negotiations are still ongoing. But we were clear in our concept of operations, which we developed in the first few weeks, a concept of operations which survived into the eventual Black Sea Agreement that I've no doubt you've all seen. And it relies on a legal framework related to the law of the sea. And this is where, of course, our colleagues from IMO had such direct experience. The elements of the agreement that I just want to rehearse and repeat are as follows. We early on dispensed with the notion of a full demining of the approaches to the Odessa ports. And this was because of the expert advice from our colleagues in the Mine Action Service that this would take 4 months, 3 to 4 months, 3 to 5 months, there were different figures, to do properly. And if you're going to do demining, you can't half demine, obviously. You've got to do it completely or not. And the alternative proposal, which is you've seen in the agreement, is for the Ukrainian authorities to provide, identify and guide ships through safe channels through the territorial waters of Ukraine from those 3 ports. And this is enshrined in the agreement. Secondly, the vessels having come through those territorial waters will then go across a defined safe corridor. You'll remember that the Russian Federation throughout this period were reminding us of the fact that they have continually identified such a corridor. Our position on that was you need to negotiate agreement on a corridor rather than simply offer it, but offering it is a good first step. That corridor, again, will be part of this, the implementation of this agreement. And this will be monitored by the Joint Coordination Center, which, as you've seen, is now up and running in Istanbul, thanks to Turkey, and the Turkish military, who've been so central to all these negotiations. And so ships involved in the initiative, in other words, going in and out, going in to get grain and out with grain, will be identified as part of the standard ship movements identification system, but will be identified as part of this initiative by the Joint Coordination Center, and then they will go through these identified lanes. And providing they remain in the lanes, the safe channels and the safe corridor, they will be protected from any military activity, because the agreement, as you know, provides for an absence of any attacks on movements of ships in those areas, and indeed protects port facilities engaged in this initiative. So you've got the safe channels, the corridor, the suspension of, the protection from military activity in those corridors, but not beyond that. The war, the war goes on, of course. And the JCC with the 2 parties, Turkey and us, monitoring and overseeing this. And where there are problems arising, as there will be, they will address it together in that center. And that center is very similar to the experience that many of us have had on ceasefire mechanism monitoring centers elsewhere. 2 more final points to make on the elements of the agreement. One is the inspection of shipping, which is provided for probably in a Turkish port. And this is of ships going in to the Odessa ports to ensure that there's no weapons aboard, and people aren't taking advantage of this particular grain operation. And then there will be presence, in the Odessa ports of the UN and Turkey to monitor the onloading of grain onto the vessels, so that they are, they're generally just part of the initiative, and then they sail out as directed by the JCC. Since the signing, of course, there was the attack on Saturday morning, and this was a reminder that we had no time to waste. That was at least a reminder about that. And we knew that we had no time to waste because of the requirement to get the grain out of Ukraine and into the open market. To me, with limited experience in the UN, this has been about the most rapid stand-up of an operation that I could think of. The Joint Coordination Center, with representatives from the Russian Federation, Ukraine, Turkey, and the UN, started its work 2 days ago, formally launched yesterday, of course, by the Defense Minister of Turkey, and has spent its time in detailed negotiation of standard operating procedures, which will put the agreement into a form of practice. And this needs to be negotiated, of course, between between the four entities represented there, the four members. In addition, been meeting with members of the shipping commercial community and the insurance community. Our colleagues in IMO, Fred Kenny and Pete Adam, had frequent meetings with them as we went through the negotiations, because as Vera Songwe was pointing out this morning, this is as much about price as it is about availability of food. And we continue to be reassured by those two communities, the insurance and the shipping communities, that what we have in mind is a viable operation. But there's a lot of detail that's necessary to share with them, because this is essentially, Black Sea Initiative is a commercial operation. There will, however, be a very large part played by the World Food Programme, who are our sort of integrated partners in this, who will be buying Ukrainian grain for export to the humanitarian market, and they're very active already in being one of the first out of the block. And then finally is getting the thing moving. Getting the procedures is an essential precondition to safe movements of ships. So it's no surprise that we haven't seen a ship move yet. There are, as you know, ships with grain in those Odessa ports ready to leave. And we had been hoping to see that happen even today or tomorrow. But we can only see that happen safely when those procedures are clear and the parties in the JCC have agreed to those movements, and where exactly is the corridor, and get it absolutely nailed down. So I think we'll see this very quickly. We are seeking to get those ports back to pre-war export levels. That's, I think, roughly 5 million metric tons a month. It's in addition to all the other routes that have been so important, rail, other routes maybe through the Danube. It's a both and, it's not an either or, and that's really important. And what we're hoping to achieve is a joint coordination center with the two parties, and Turkey and us, that will understand the procedures and apply them fairly and apply them, without obstruction. This is going to be important. In any such arrangement, as in a ceasefire arrangement, building the esprit de corps between the parties is of the highest importance, and is from a standing start. I would say that the negotiations that we have been intensely involved, particularly in the last couple of weeks. The negotiations went right up to Thursday night, finalizing the agreement. There was a lot of very constructive, helpful negotiations between those two parties. But I don't think I've had experience of an agreement like this one, in which two warring parties, still very much at war, of course, understandably, have come together for an agreement which is not about ending the war, like a ceasefire often is, and therefore puts the parties in a different place. This isn't about ending the war. This is an agreement which continues despite the war, and in which the two parties sitting in that center in Istanbul, enemies still, need to work together to bring to fruition the things that they have agreed to. And as we know, of course, there is the provisions of the operation negotiated so well by Rebecca Greenspan between the Russian Federation and the United Nations. Huge thanks to Turkey. This project started in Ankara when the Secretary General met President Erdogan. And of course, they were together in Istanbul the other day. It's extremely important for us to be sitting in that center with Turkey and their military. And they have done a lot of the negotiations throughout this 3 months period. And we've been very closely involved with them. Thank you.
For questions? Yeah, Edie.
Thank you very much, Mr. Griffiths, on behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association. Thank you so much for doing this agreement, and I'm sure we all appreciate the important role that you yourself played in reaching this deal. Just one follow-up on what you said. You seem to indicate that there were only going to be inspections in Turkey of ships going in, not leaving, and that something was going to happen in Odessa. What about the other two ports? Could you just clarify that for us? My question is, there's been a lot of expectation this week that we were going to see the first ships move maybe today. Now, you know, it's possibly tomorrow or whatever. Could you elaborate a little more on the procedural issues that are holding this up? And the Associated Press did a story after contacting a number of shipping companies who didn't seem horribly enthusiastic about sending their ships in to Ukraine to pick up this grain. And I know you just said that this was going to be a commercial operation. How concerned are you that there are still going to be problems with shipping companies and insurance? Thank you.
I realize I didn't speak to the many other crises that I was supposed to. Natasha is looking at me. I actually do want to say one or two words about Somalia, perhaps at the end. Yeah, it's the three ports. You know, so it's Odessa and the two ports together. There will be monitoring there, as I say, by UN and Turkish representatives of the onloading of grain onto those vessels, and therefore, in principle, there is no reason for any further inspection. If, however, and the agreement does provide for this, if, however, any of those ships going out now, exporting from the Odessa ports out to the world, if they do not stick to the agreed plan, they drift outside the lanes or whatever, or if they, make contact with other ships, then there is a provision for a response by the project, by the JCC, for any inspection to make sure that there's nothing untoward going on. But the essential agreement on inspections was of the ships going in, and that is central to the agreement. The holding this up, I don't think we're day 6 of this agreement. I don't go along with the idea that we're holding things up at the moment. To get people to deploy to the Joint Coordination Center, to find that center, to staff it, to get the equipment in there, because it's like a technical center, an oversight center. It takes more than a day. And here's the point, Edie, I think, and it goes a little bit to your point about the commercial sector. If ships move without the right procedures to approving those movements, then they are at risk. And the commercial sector would be right not to wish to move. So we need to get those procedures finalized. And it has to do with, just to give you an illustration, it has to do with what are the exact coordinates of the channels, right? There's a general reference in the agreement. We need exact coordinate of the channels. How will we have fulfilled our obligation to monitor the onloading of those ships, given the fact those ships have grain in them already? So that while there is an absolute priority for humanitarian reasons alone for those ships to move, and the fact that there are those many ships now ready, with grain, ready to go, we still need to make sure they're going to make safe passage. Because if there was a first ship and it did not make a safe passage, then we would have a hold-up. My information on the commercial viability of it, from colleagues in Istanbul is consistently that, no, there is an appetite for this. And there is at a reasonable price. That's the insurance room. And that's what came across in the meeting held on Wednesday, yesterday, indeed, virtual meeting in Istanbul of these sectors. But, we'll see. We'll see.
James?
James Bays, Al Jazeera. Like Edie, I have a quick follow-up and then a question. The follow-up is on your mention of the attack in Odessa. What was your reaction when you heard about that? And Mr. Lavrov says it's not covered by the agreement and we're allowed to attack the port in Odessa. Could you just clarify that for us, what the UN's position is? And my question is about the relief you can give to people around the world. You mentioned Somalia a short time ago and other countries. When do you think, one, you can start getting this grain to people where it's going to have an effect? And how long do you think it's going to take, if you get the ships loaded and there's no interruption, to actually start making a dent in the global food crisis?
The second one first. We saw on the day of the signing, as you know, a reduction in the price of food. It was was the first time for me. I'd not been involved in business in my life, but it was interesting to see the impact of the work that we're all doing immediately. It was a very sensitive indicator, and I think it crept back up over the weekend. But the diminution in prices is of the highest importance, as you know, and that has an immediate potential impact on those places. But I did ask yesterday colleagues in the World Food Programme, the sense of your question, James, when would a ship with grain leaving Odessa reach Somalia? As an example of that. This would be a humanitarian shipment, let's say. And the answer was it would take about 4 weeks or something to get from A to B. But I believe it's the case that the market of grain is much more fungible than this. So it isn't just about getting that grain out, it's about the fungibility of grain, the price of grain. I think and also there's also the Russian exports, to which I'm less knowledgeable, but is bigger in volume, and in fertilizer. And fertilizer, ammonia has come into our agreement as well, into the Ukraine export. So I hope that the market response will be quick, and then the material response will come along. The reaction to the attack, well, had it not been 12 hours since we signed the agreement, we would have had a functioning joint coordination centre. And the first thing that would have happened is that centre would have met to say, was this in fact a breach of the agreement or not? Back to your question about Foreign Minister Lavrov. Was it covered? First of all, what happened? Was it prohibited under the agreement or not? Was it a part of a port engaged in this initiative? And this is something that we will need collectively to address when we are putting together our operation in the Odessa ports, is to clarify exactly what is and isn't covered by this. Because this is, as I said earlier, this is an operation in war. And that makes it both more dangerous and more complicated. So that's the first thing. Was it or was it not? A JCC would have immediately sat down and pointed the finger and stuff. The second thing that occurred to me when I was in Istanbul at the time was this is going to happen a lot. This is going to be as bumpy a road, I think, as any project of this kind that I have had any involvement in. It's going to demand a great deal of political time as well as logistical efforts. It's going to require the building of confidence, as I said, between parties, which is a big ask, but which has been a factor in getting us to where we are today. There are going to be arguments between the parties about the aspects of the agreement. And we're very, very lucky in the UN that we're sitting there with Turkey, that the two of us, in a sense, have common interests and objectives, and it's good to have a partner in those rooms. So I think that center is our leadership in that center. I'm not saying we're leading the center, but having the right UN people there is going to be of the highest importance. And, you know, when there are problems from either way, that we continue to maintain our contacts with Kyiv and Moscow. What was striking and hugely impressive about the Ukrainian response to that attack was that they stayed the course. And they said, we're going to continue to do this. And I really want to give my credit, obviously, to President Zelensky on that, but also to Alexander Kubrakov, who signed the agreement, the Infrastructure and Transport Minister, who has been our interlocutor throughout, who's really an exceptional talent. To steer your way through those kind of discussions in Kyiv on that morning could not have been easy.
Michelle?
Thanks, Mr. Griffiths. Michelle Nichols from Reuters. Thanks for coming to speak to us. We've wanted to speak to you for quite some time. A couple of follow-ups. You spoke this morning as well about, and just now, about the standard operating procedures that are being worked out at the moment. Are you coming across any potential big hurdles with that? When can we expect that to be agreed? And is there any possibility that, as some of my colleagues understand it, some of these first couple of ships that might move, one or two or maybe all of them are Turkey flagged, like, is there a possibility they might move before the SOP is agreed, just to show that this can be done? And then how long does the insurers and the shippers, how long do they need to then be able to get their operations going once the SOP is agreed? And do you foresee any problems with, like, fuel, crews, those kind of issues in Ukraine? Thanks.
I'm not in the Joint Coordination Center, so your question about would Turkey sail early is a good one. We've thought in our negotiations that might happen. I doubt it, because I think the Turkish shippers would be equally interested in the guarantee of safety that comes with the application of those agreed procedures, and that's taken time. There's no particular, answering the first part of your question, Michelle, there's nothing particular that we are running up against of great difficulty. But, you know, the people in the room there, and they're all in that same room together. They're getting to know each other at the same time as dealing with quite specific issues. For example, which are not easy or obvious. For example, what is the area of protection against military attack? What's the length and width of it, and so forth. It's not easy. You have to come up with a clear idea and a reason for it's going to be this and not that. But I don't think we've got killing issues yet. Well, that's encouraging. There are Turkish ships there. There are non-Turkish ships there also with grain sitting in them, waiting to go. One of the ones that we had hoped to see first out of the block was it was not a Turkish ship. In fact, it was others. But in a way, there is, of course, a sort of a political moment, isn't there? Who's first out? But from the UN point of view, it doesn't matter. It would be better if the ship, whichever it was, went to somewhere in real need. And that is something that we have been discussing with the ship owners. We don't see any scale likely to happen. It goes back to Edie's question in a way, that without our procedures being clear, understood by the commercial sector, and the system moving. They know what to do. We also have an obligation, I think, have an obligation to report publicly and internationally, I think, on movements, tonnages, plans. Will we get, how much are we likely to get out of Ukraine by the time the harvest really comes in, which is soon now? What will we get out by October, and so forth? We're going to have to develop with our people on the ground there a sort of a protocol for briefing. And it should include, and we're already talking about this with WFP, it should include, from the UN point of view, the aspect of the humanitarian impact. How much of this is going to, Central African Republic or Southern Sudan? Because famine is a huge issue for us this year.
Yeah, that's just a quick follow-up, actually. Is a lot of this grain that's ready to go, is it already contracted
I
to be
think-
sold? Like, how do you know it is going to get to the right countries?
Well, it's a commercial operation, and so it isn't a humanitarian operation. And that was a deliberate decision, that a commercial operation is a better way to make the thing work than to have it fronted by humanitarian priorities. But although WFP is a big operation, and they will do that. But we obviously want priorities to go to people who are facing the kind of privation and potential famine that we're seeing in particularly 17 districts, is it, of Somalia, where you have people in famine-like conditions. Thank God for the American generosity, the US generosity in these recent days. Samantha Power was in the region, over $1 billion going into the Horn. It's too late for many people. And for us in Ocha, back in my day job, this is the story. This Horn is the story. And we have to get there and get the prices right, get the aid money right, get the capacity to respond right. 17 districts with, I can't remember the numbers, but it's in my briefing, people at risk of famine. We haven't seen anything like that for 40 years in that region.
Thank you, sir. Ben Schwinghammer with the German press agency. I wonder, it's actually just a follow-up to Michelle. I wonder if you could lay out with a bit more detail how the decision-making process in the JCC is happening. Are the representatives of Russia and Ukraine talking directly with each other, or will your staff and the Turkey staff
All
be a buffer?
together. We have photographs of them all together in the same room. Equally, equal rights kind of thing. And that's how it's got to work. And as I say, we know that from direct experience in, Syria ceasefire management, for example. We've really got a lot of experience in that. Some key people in the Russian Federation who have that direct experience from Syria and who are very helpful to us in the negotiations to understand, because they knew the concept. So you have those four with different roles, right? Turkey and UN, obviously a different role to the parties. But we need to agree on key issues. But there's also procedures like the need to address, do you have a veto if one person says this and that? Ideally not. That's not the habit in a ceasefire monitoring mechanism. That's the kind of thing that needs to be thrashed out. It's got to be done clearly and quickly. And most of the people in that room are military. And, the military does understand operating procedures, doesn't it? And some of our people, we're run by an ex-admiral, so that helps.
Joe?
Thank you. Joseph Klein, Canada Free Press. Two quick questions on the agreement itself and then the negotiating process. Does the agreement, the Black Sea Initiative agreement, have a sunset clause, or does it continue to roll on as long as there's determination that there's grain that is available that needs to get out to where it's needed? You brought up the veto issue. Was there any dispute resolution mechanism discussed or incorporated in the agreement itself? And whatever that mechanism may be, or if there's going to be one incorporated in these operating procedures, is there contemplation that it would be binding on the parties? And in the negotiation process, since you've said this is a commercial operation, to what degree was there consultation and hopefully obtaining some level of commitments from shippers and insurance companies in advance of the final signing of the agreement, so that everyone would have a sense as to whether this is going to be able to quickly take off? Thank you.
Thank you. Taking the last one first, yes. Right at the beginning of the 3 months, we had 2 people seconded from International Maritime Organization, whose job in that organization was dealing on a daily basis with the shipping community, the Lloyd's War Risks Committee and so forth. And they kept in touch with them throughout. And that was obviously incredibly important because we needed to have the elements and the proposals in place or being considered that would lead to a commercially viable operation. And we needed to keep checking with them. If this happens, is that okay? Will that work with you? Will safe channels be sufficient? Will safe channels with guidance by search and rescue tugs and pilots from Ukraine, is that an added need, and so forth? So those contacts have been throughout the negotiation and largely reassuring. But then, as you know, as I was saying with Edie, let's see the implementation. But in that regard, the meeting that was held, very large meeting yesterday morning in Istanbul by, again, our team with the shipping sectors, and I've seen some of it, was very detailed about what was needed and what the procedures will include will be how do commercial operators clock into the JCC process and so forth. So I have to see that. The sunset clause, the agreement reached between the Russian Federation and the UN negotiated by Rebecca Greenspan, is for 3 years. I think I'm right in saying it's for 3 years. Ours, as it were, the Black Sea one, is for 120 days. The MOU signed for a 3-year period also includes, I think, a reference to, which was the Russian Federation wanted to include, and it was very useful, a reference to Russia continuing to facilitate the export of grains from Ukraine. So we have a slightly different sort of timing, but it's 120 days renewable. We aren't going to finish the work on this Black Sea grain export until the war is over. I think that sort of speaks for itself, doesn't it? So we are planning to go as long as it takes, and we are hopefully going to recruit people to deploy them for as long as it takes. But there's a formal, a bit like the Syria resolution, there's a formal requirement to renew over 120 days. And because the two agreements are a single package, the two agreements live and die together. Binding the parties, binding in the sense of an agreement made around the table, but this isn't arbitration. This is a voluntary agreement, just like every ceasefire that I've had anything to do with is a voluntary agreement. And parties stick with it because they have an interest, and parties stick with it because, of course, the pronouncements of, in our case, the JCC will become public. And if the parties don't have an interest, they walk, don't they? I think one of the very important things the Secretary General did right at the beginning of this negotiation was to insist on a single package. We know that the world needs the export of Russian grains and fertilizers. They're not sanctioned. There was no sanctions relief involved in the Rebecca Greenspan negotiation, but removing impediments is crucial to getting those out, and that's a very important part of the single package. And I think it will speak to the fact that we should be able to make this work together. Let's see.
Gregory?
Thank you very much, Farhan. Mr. Griffiths, I was just asking about the appointment of Admiral Kenny. And so some countries does not consider the U.S., which is Mr. Kenny's representative of U.S. citizen, as a neutral actor of the situation in Ukraine. And so I just wondering, just to clarify, what was the procedure looks like for appointment such UN senior official. So does it require formal approval or any approval from the parties? Thank you.
I'm British, and I was the mediator, and nobody suggested, I'm very glad to say, that just because I happened to be British, that I was not faithful to my oath to the United Nations as a UN staff member, where we don't have a nationality in the regard of our professional responsibilities. And the same goes for Fred Kenny, who is a UN official of some seniority. He's not an American. He's a United Nations official deployed by the Secretary General into that function. I would be astonished, really would be astonished, if anybody was making complaints about the nationalities of UN staff. I know this happens elsewhere, but the UN holds firm to the integrity of our international officials.
Thank you, Farhan. Thank you for the briefing. My name is Ibtisam Azim from Al Arabi Al Jadid newspaper. So I have first a follow-up. Hi. I have first a follow-up question on what you said regarding the movement of ships. So just to clarify, so the ships will not move unless they have the green light from the GCC in coordination with your people on the ground on Odessa port from the UN and the Turkish authorities. Am I correct understanding that?
Yeah, the JCC, which includes the parties,
Yes,
not just
and
UN and Turkey.
yes, of
yeah,
course.
Yeah. As a collective, they would monitor and oversee the movement of vessels who want to be part of this initiative, who want to go in and get grain.
My question is on the issue of Russia and the export of their grain and fertilizers and the conditions they put. And they talked several times about the fact that they want to see also the export of their grain. And you touched a little bit upon the impediments that there are there. How worried are you that if there will be no movement, then that the whole agreement, no movement in the export of Russian grain, that the whole agreement is going to collapse? And are we seeing any steps in this regard?
Well, both agreements need to be fully implemented.
There,
Well, it's 6 days. You know, I really, time is not exactly lapsed, but there has been a lot of movement with the comfort letters that we've seen from the US and the EU, which were central to the negotiation of the agreement. The role of Rebecca Greenspan's team in UNCTAD to facilitate that movement. I'm not I don't disagree with you about how important it is. It is important. It's important for the world. This, as the Secretary General made it clear in many of his interviews, didn't he, on Friday? I think he was interviewed by the BBC, who said this is a reward to Russia. He said this is not a reward to Russia. This is about the world needing the export of those products. But the two things do go together, and we need to do it at scale in both places, for the world, but also for the integrity of these two agreements.
Okay,
Last one.
two final questions, Evelyn and then Linda.
Thank you very much for the briefing. Evelyn Leopold, Globetrotter Media, among other outlets. Could you kindly review for us your role in the negotiations as well as your role from now on? That's one question. The second is, fingers crossed that the Russians won't bomb again in Odessa. How likely are you to get a resolution of why they did it this time and what Minister Lavrov said and whether it's true or not? You're looking into that, and that could be very dangerous and encourage them to bomb in the future or not. And a third question is, will the Ukrainian farmers get paid once this begins to move?
Yeah. Yes, I think so, because it's a commercial operation, and they'll sell their product, no doubt, through the traders that they have been selling it through for generations. The JCC is focusing now not on what happened on Saturday, but what will happen tomorrow. So they're not focused on that attack, that event. And in any case, as I said earlier, I think we need to establish the presence in the Odessa ports, the three ports. and have clarity about what is covered and what is not covered. But as I say, I think there will be military activities, because they're not forbidden, as it were, by this agreement, but in areas contiguous to this agreement, which will provide shocks that the JCC will need to address together. My role is, the Secretary General asked me, this is 3 months ago, to mediate, to be the UN mediator. I mean, I was the UN lead within these four, the two parties and Turkey. And so I led that, and I have a background, I think, in mediation. But going ahead, the reason why I think he asked me to do it was because it's intrinsic to it is its humanitarian nature. And this was very important in terms of the agreement made. We had already been very involved in detailed and constructive and productive discussions in Moscow on access in Ukraine for humanitarian operations. I had myself been involved in that. So we built on this together. Not together, I mean, he asked me to do it as a result of that. But of course, my principal role is head of OCHA. I think this mission, we're still sorting out exactly how it will fit into the wiring diagram in this building, but it will report ultimately to the Secretary General. And I know from working with him these many days and weeks, he ain't going away. He should have his holiday first, maybe, but he's on it day and night, isn't he?
He's technically having a holiday.
He's technically having a holiday. I wish he would.
As we speak.
Please sleep.
Linda.
Thanks, Farhan. Mr. Griffiths, I was wondering if you could just clarify a little bit. Earlier in your opening, I believe you said something to the effect that it would take 3 months to 4 months to 5 months, depending on different assessments, for the mines to be properly removed. And I guess the operative word is properly. Can you just expand on that in terms of what that really means in terms of shipping, getting the weed out? And are there any other countries who might be brought in who have expertise to help with this?
There's the notion at the beginning of this negotiation was there were a lot of member states saying they'll go and do demining for the Ukrainians. I think these are useful offers, but we soon discovered that if you really want to get rid of all the mines in that area, the territorial waters of Ukraine outside those ports, all of that. They're both Russian mines and Ukrainian mines, of course. You need to get rid of them all. If you're going to declare an area mine-free, you better be damn sure that it's mine-free. And that's why our experts in the Mine Action Service said to us right at the beginning, they said, this is too long a process to be practicable. But there is an alternative. And we had a lot of discussions in those first 6 weeks, perhaps, of the negotiation about whether this alternative that is now in the agreement was sufficiently safe. It's essential that the safe channels are identified clearly by, of course, the Ukrainian authorities. They're responsible for making sure that security in those waters is adequate. But we are overseeing that. We, the JCC, are overseeing that. Last one.
Did you have any? Do you have a chance for a little bit more?
Not much. I think we need to go.
Okay.
No.
Why don't you both ask one after the other, and you can take them both. First you, and then Ephraim after you.
Thank you. Thanks, Farhan. Mr. Griffith, till now the Security Council couldn't agree on statement welcoming a Green Deal. How that can affect the deal, and what is your message to the Security Council members in order to give at least a moral push or a moral support to this agreement? Thank you.
And then Ephraim.
Kusaifi with Arab News. General question on the humanitarian response in Ukraine. Since the beginning of the war, UN humanitarians have been praising the generosity of Western governments, and in the same breath lamenting the double standard and discrimination displayed by those same governments towards Syria, Yemen, and all the other crises. We're still seeing African migrants also being treated differently in some European countries. And my question to you is how much is the situation and the humanitarian response in Ukraine taking away from the focus on these other crises? And how, in your day-to-day work, do you deal with this double standard and discrimination? What do you tell the the leaders in Europe, and just how do you deal with it? How do you tackle it? Thank you.
I've been in my job for a year now, and I started with Tigray, and then our time was taken over by Afghanistan, and then by Ukraine. This is not, what I'm trying to say is this is not new, the idea that there's a limited bandwidth of attention internationally. Ukraine didn't write the book on this, although it's certainly been an extraordinarily driven crisis for us, and in the humanitarian community, standing up from zero a humanitarian operation throughout Ukraine was a big ask. And I think we got there in due course. So the attention cycle of the international community is really, really limited to the topic du jour. And Ukraine has occupied that position understandably. I don't think that's double standard. I think that's understandable. We worried, to your question, about funding, because we were worrying throughout whether the member states who provide humanitarian funding would have less money to give to Yemen and Syria and Afghanistan and places. And the evidence on that is still a little bit at odds. Certainly in the first weeks of the Ukraine war, most donors protected the funding that they had available, they already had available for non-Ukraine conflicts. As time went on, we begin to see, I think, that is eroding because of the extent of the it's not just donor funding, but member states funding at different aspects of in terms of the war in Ukraine. So we do worry. We do worry. I never refer to it as double standards, but I do worry about whether the attention is sufficient and the priority is sufficient for people elsewhere. I spent the last 3 years on Yemen. You know, Yemen had a truce, still does, doesn't it? Extraordinarily important. A breakthrough, actually, by the parties. And it looks like under threat. So I worry as much about Yemen, and I worry even more about Somalia. So Somalia, is linked, isn't it, in the sense that Somalia is facing the effect of continued climate change. The 4 or 5 rainy seasons failed in succession. I went to Turkana in northern Kenya some weeks ago and saw exactly the consequences of drought and climate change. And then in Somalia, it's turning into famine. And they haven't had the sufficient funding that we saw in 2017 when the humanitarian community managed to avoid the worst consequences of that drought. You will remember. This year, it's worse. So I worry about it, but it's a continual dialogue with officials from these countries to say, pay attention to this as well as that. I think on the Security Council, I can see that it's having difficulties getting a statement out between the members. I don't think that was surprising to us. We do not rely on a statement from the Council to back up the operation. As I said at the beginning, the legal basis is the agreement itself, but also the law of the sea, the legal basis for inspection of shipping, for example. So yes, it would be very nice if the Council could do a statement, but we'll forge ahead and do what our job is, our duties are now. Thank you very much, Farhan.
Thanks. And I'd like to thank our guest, Martin Griffiths, one more time. And